everyone. Have you been breeding your goats this month, or are you getting ready to start next month? The last two scheduled live streams I did, last Monday night and the Monday night before that, I talked about breeding your goats and the nutrition and all that kind of stuff. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the next step, and that is pregnancy. So if you missed the last videos, you can find them on the YouTube channel. Tonight, so first of all, early signs of pregnancy. There are, like everything related to goats, there are a lot of myths online and stuff about how to tell if your goat is pregnant, but we're going to talk about like the good ways to figure out if your goat is pregnant. I haven't heard anybody mention the Clorox test in a while, which is good news. Maybe it has finally died. I think if the people at Clorox knew they could predict pregnancy with their bleach, that they would have probably jumped on that already and be selling it for that purpose, but they're not. So that is one we won't be talking about tonight. So one of the first things a lot of people think of is what kind of physical changes do your goats have when they are pregnant? One of them is that they're going to gain weight, just like people do. One of the things I love about my Goats 365 members is that they ask me questions about things that I may have never thought of before. And a few years ago, one of our members asked me, how much weight should my goat gain during pregnancy? And I had no idea. So we got a dog scale and we started weighing our goats. And it occurred to me that this was a great way to actually know if your goat was pregnant. Because if they're not pregnant, they don't gain any weight. And so that very first year, we discovered that one of our goats wasn't pregnant because she weighed the same after at the end of what was supposed to be her pregnancy as she did 5 months earlier. So we have Nigerian dwarfs, and so they could have anywhere, typically twins, triplets, quads. And so we definitely discovered that there is a big difference in weight gain depending on how many kids they're carrying. So that also gave us a little bit of a clue in terms of how many kids to expect, because the goats who were pregnant with twins gained about 10 pounds less than the goats that were pregnant with quads. Now, don't count on this too much, because I always tell people, this is why, like, you can't just look at a goat and say, oh, she's carrying triplets or quads, because 12 pounds of kids is going to look about the same, whether you've got 4 3-pound kids or 3 4-pound kids, because 3 times 4 equals 4 times 3. So, and I have seen that. Some of my goats do give birth to 4-pound kids. So, if I see 3, I'm looking at a goat going, whoa, she's probably going to have quads. And then 3 really big kids come out, it's like, oh, okay, or 3 really big kids. And that's what she had. So weight gain is definitely a great way to determine if your goat is pregnant. I think I have another video on here already that talked about that, the spreadsheet that we created with that information. And so if you're curious about that, just ask in the comment section and we can give you a link to that video later. So you're not really going to tell anything different about your goat for the first couple of months in terms of whether or not she's pregnant. Not much changes in the first couple of months. And one thing, the only thing really is that you shouldn't see your goat coming into heat again. If she does come into heat again, then she probably didn't get pregnant. So go ahead and breed her again. We've had about 775 kids in the last 23 years, and we have had 2 goats that continued to come into heat even though they were pregnant, and we kept breeding them again. And the first time this happened to me, I got surprised on July 4th when we came home from a party and found triplet kids in the pasture, because I didn't think she was going to be kidding until September. And as it turned out, she had gotten pregnant that very first time that we bred her. And so there we had a set of triplets that were born in July. I was not going to be fooled twice. So the next time I had a goat, So after that, I always wrote down every possible due date. So whenever I breed a goat, I put down, in 5 months, 145 days, I put, that this goat is at 145 days. And I start looking for an udder and all the changes and stuff as she's approaching that due date. And if nothing, and if it doesn't look promising, then I look at the next possible due date. And pretty much it's always going to be the later due dates, because think about this, only 2 times out of all the hundreds of pregnancies that our goats have had, only 2 times did we have goats that kept coming into heat even though they were already pregnant. So that is really very rare. But with goats, nothing is impossible. Some of them just did not read the rule book. So false pregnancies are something I would like to talk about just a little bit. Again, they are really rare. We've had 1 out of all of the goats that we've had. There was a goat that I very much thought was pregnant, and because she was a milker and she dried up when she was 3 months pregnant, and the udder shrunk up, and then a month later the udder started getting big again. And then all of a sudden, one day when she was supposed to be a couple weeks away from her due date, her belly was small. And then after that, the udder just shrunk up to nothing. So that was obviously a false pregnancy. False pregnancies can happen. Sometimes they happen as a result of a goat losing a pregnancy very early in gestation. And so you don't know it. There's just so little that gets passed that you don't see anything. However, the body didn't get the memo. And so the body still thinks it's pregnant. So the uterus continues to fill up with fluid. The udder starts to fill up with milk. The body does all the things that it's supposed to do when it's pregnant. And in fact, the hormone levels, if you do a blood test on these goats, the hormone levels will even show that the goat is pregnant, even though she's not. So the only way to know if you have a false pregnancy is with an ultrasound. And I'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. Let's see. So actually, I will talk about ultrasounds now. Ultrasounds are good for a yes, no. Like an ultrasound is the one way that you would know for sure that your goat has a real pregnancy if they see real babies in there. However, the ultrasound is only as good as the person who is actually doing it. When we were new to goats, we were real excited about ultrasounds, and we were doing ultrasounds. And then someone did our ultrasound who really did not know what they were doing, because he told us we had 5 pregnant goats when we really had 0 pregnant goats. And the funny thing is that we were just really impatient. It was like we took these goats in. Well, what had happened was a tree branch fell on the fence between the bucks and the does, and we found the bucks in with the does, and nobody, and October came and nobody was in heat. And so I was like, oh my gosh, all 5 of those goats got pregnant the day that that branch fell on the fence. So I took the goats in, and then 3 or 4 days after the ultrasound, all of the goats started coming into heat. So clearly nobody was pregnant, and the person doing the test was just wrong. Now, things that you cannot learn from an ultrasound are, you cannot know how many kids she is carrying with much accuracy. I am sure there are people who will tell you that they can. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. I have seen far more people get this wrong than get it right. I have seen so many people worried, like, oh my gosh, they told me my goat was going to have 3 or 4 and she's only had 2. What do I do? Well, there's every sign that this goat is done. She's up, she's eating, she's past her placenta, the kids are nursing, she's acting 100% normal. Really doesn't sound like she's got more kids in there. I think the person who did your ultrasound was incorrect. On the flip side, I've had people, say that, oh, I only see 1. And then 1 kid is born, and then people leave the barn because they're new. So they don't realize that the goat's not done. by looking at how the goat is acting and stuff. They have one baby and they leave the barn, and then they come back later and there's another one, or maybe two more. So the problem with ultrasound is that it's not 3D. You're just looking at it, just like this. Just like me right now, you're looking at me. Like there could be somebody behind me and you wouldn't see them because I'm blocking your view of them. There could be a couple dogs behind me. You wouldn't see them because I'm blocking your view. So it is entirely possible that you can have more kids than what somebody says. And it's also possible that you could have less, because some people will try to count babies even though they're not in the same screenshot together. So the only way that you would know that you're having like at least two babies is if you're looking at the picture and there's two babies in that picture. The second they move the probe, you don't know if you're still looking at the same kids. Somebody called me once in a complete panic because she was told her goat was having 7 babies. And I said, I don't really do this because I don't think it's possible to know how many babies a goat's going to have by looking at it. But I really do want to see a picture of your goat. So if you could take some pictures of your goat, like standing from behind, standing in the front, standing on the side, so I can see how deep her belly goes, and send them to me, I would love to see them. And so she sent me these photos, and this was a first freshening 2-year-old. And I looked at this goat and I was like, that goat really looks like she's having twins. Like, she is the most average pregnant sized goat. I mean, she just really looks like she's having twins. And this woman was just adamant, oh no, the girl who did the ultrasound's been raising goats her whole life. She really knows what she's doing. And guess how many goats the doe had? 2. So counting kids and you can't tell genders either. So don't expect that. All you can do really from an ultrasound is get a yes or a no. Is the goat pregnant? Yes or no. And even then, we had somebody make a mistake 5 times. So blood tests are very accurate, and so are milk tests. Blood and milk are testing for the same thing. They're looking for the hormones. Blood tests, you would do the venous puncture in the neck, just like you do for biosecurity testing and stuff. Some labs will run a pregnancy test at the same time that they run biosecurity tests. So if you want to do your biosecurity testing for CAE, CL, and Yonis in the fall, 30 days after you bred your goat, and with one tube of blood, you can tell, is this goat pregnant? And and is the goat negative for these 3 diseases? So that is really convenient. If you happen to be on milk test, I know Dairy One in New York has a milk pregnancy test. We have done that multiple times. Back when we were on milk test, we would always do it. It's super easy if you're on milk test because you just put a note. We would just put a note in there to say, on samples number 2, 4, and 9, also run a pregnancy test. And they can run that and let you know if the goat is pregnant. And in our experience, they were always correct. So that one is really good. Last year, we had a buck escape and get in with our does. And there were some does in there that we really did not want to get pregnant. And if they were pregnant, we really needed to know because they were older and had health problems and stuff. But we were still milking them. They just should not have gotten pregnant again. And so we did, even though we're not on milk test anymore, we called Dairy One and got the test tubes to be able to send in the milk to get tests on them. And everybody came back negative, and everyone was indeed not pregnant, which was very good news for those 2 goats that we did not want to be pregnant. And then typically what most people do is just wait and watch, just to see the goat does not come back into heat again. And ideally also if you weigh your goat, like there are those fancy livestock scales, but you can also get dog scales at pet stores that cost a lot less than the fancy livestock scales. And so we've also done that. And you don't see much weight gain until they're closer to about 3 months. And then you start to see a few pounds. And then just like people, the last month or 2 is when they really start to put on a lot of weight. because that's when the babies are doing most of their growing. Nutrition during pregnancy is really, really important. It's probably been 7 or 8 years ago since there was this article. It was a study, and I put the word study in quotes because not every study is a good study. Not every study tells us what we should be doing. And you never want to just look at the results of a study and say, oh, I'm going to do this. And that was the case with that particular study. It only had 12 to 15 goats, and it was in Africa. And they said that if you did not feed grain to your goats, that they would have all kinds of problems. And the reality is, when you looked at these goats, when you look at the outcomes for everybody, it's like, well, yeah, the ones that didn't get grain had a lot of problems, but even the ones who did get grain had a lot of problems. And this was in Africa, which is a completely different place. They have completely different feeds, different climate, different everything than we do. And I know I get contacted by people all over the world who have goat questions. And so I've never talked to anybody in Africa who has access to any kind of goat minerals. And the kind of problems that these goats were having had nothing to do with whether or not they were getting grain. They all were very, very much related to what looked like mineral deficiencies. And so it's really important that you not just go, oh, well, this study said you should do this. Read the whole thing and see, how was the study set up? Where was it? What were underlying conditions? In this case, the underlying conditions were the goats simply were not getting good nutrition, period. And so the lesson that we have to take away from that is that our goats need good nutrition during pregnancy. And that does not necessarily mean grain. It means that they need a good mineral. I've talked about minerals so much in so many videos. You want your goats to have a mineral that's got at least, for a mineral that's got around 15 to 20% salt, you want that mineral to have around 1700 ppm copper, and you want it to have about 50 ppm selenium. And the amount of zinc that it has should be about 4 times as much copper, because copper and zinc are mutually antagonistic. So too much of either one can cause a deficiency in the other one. So copper and zinc always need to be in balance. And a lot of times you will find there's quite a few minerals out there that just don't have enough zinc in them. And all three of these are the most common minerals that goats in the United States and Canada become deficient in. And those are the ones why it's really important to make sure that you have a good mixed mineral, loose goat mineral that is available, free choice, 365 days a year for your goats. The other thing is that once your goats are 3 months pregnant, you should stop milking them. And for most goats, they're usually going to dry up because their body realizes we need to start allocating resources to the babies, not towards milk production. So most goats will dry up when they're 3 months pregnant. In fact, in my herd, I have seen this so much that if a goat does not dry up at 3 months, I just assume she's not pregnant. Years ago, when my daughters were still home, and I was by the book, I would tell them, oh, stop milking so-and-so because she's 3 months pregnant. And my daughter would say, oh, no, she's not pregnant. Her milk supply is not going down at all. And I would insist that she was pregnant and tell her to stop milking. And sad to say that the teenager was right 100% of the time in those situations. I have talked to a very, very small number of people who have had goats that would not dry up. And we're talking less than 1% here, much, much less than 1%, serious heavy duty bucket busters. These actually, the people I've talked to who've done this are people who have goats in dairies. They've had some goats that don't want to dry up. And so they just keep milking them. If you do that, they are not going to have colostrum for the babies. So you would have to use colostrum from another goat for them. But typically they dry up at 3 months. Otherwise, I would want to double check to make sure that they're pregnant, like do an ultrasound or a blood test or milk test or something to see if they're pregnant. More feed is not better. If you overfeed a goat and she doesn't need it, the extra calories and protein and calcium are going to go to the babies and grow bigger babies. The other thing is that an obese doe is more at risk for toxemia, because if she has a lot of internal fat, she's not able to eat enough, because the fat is taking up space in her abdomen that should be filling up with feed. So it's really important that you not overfeed a goat, because you don't want her to get overweight and you don't want her babies to grow too big. Another example I can give you on that is that many years ago, when we had a problem with dewormer resistance in our herd, we had a lot of goats that were very underweight. And so when they were milking, we were giving them an extra high protein feed, and it had 30% protein to try and get some meat on their bones, because the dewormers were not helping them. And I had tried I had tried everything anybody had ever told me, from Shaklee Basic H to all the herbs and the essential oils and all the things, and none of them worked. So anyway, we were just trying to keep weight on the goats. My daughter misunderstood me, and she was giving that very high protein feed to the pregnant goats also. And that year we had some really, really huge kids, until I realized what she was doing and told her to stop. And so overfeeding goats is definitely not good. You want to be feeding them alfalfa hay for the last 2 months, because goats need a lot of calcium to grow bones in those babies. Now, if you've been online much at all, you've probably seen somebody say, don't feed alfalfa to pregnant goats because it causes hypocalcemia. And this unfortunately comes from cattle research. Of course, there is massive quantities of cattle research, because there's so many cows in this country and not very many goats, which is why so many people think goats are just little cows, and like, oh, well, if this is true in cows, it must be true in goats. However, one of the really big differences between goats and cows is hypocalcemia. So a cow almost always has a single. Goats almost always have 2 or more babies. And so cows are much bigger milkers, especially modern dairy cows that are being given hormones to produce more. Cows are much more likely to get hypocalcemia after calving. So they calve and their body kicks into gear, making massive quantities of milk, and that's when they get hypocalcemia. Goats, on the other hand, are much more likely to get hypocalcemia at the end of pregnancy, because their body is growing all of these fetuses, and every one of those babies has a lot of bones. So the goats are trying to grow lots of babies, and if they don't have enough calcium, they wind up with hypocalcemia at the end of pregnancy. And toxemia can frequently be right behind that, because toxemia happens when there's not enough protein. Alfalfa is fabulous because it gives your goats lots of protein and lots of calcium. So if you are giving them 100% alfalfa, then they shouldn't really, as long as they're in good body condition and everything, they should do okay without an added goat feed. However, if you can't find 100% alfalfa and you're feeding like just a partial alfalfa, then that's not enough protein. So you would at that point add a small amount of the 16% protein goat feed to increase the protein. However, there's not much calcium at all in goat feed, so they really need a legume for that. If you're in a part of the country that doesn't necessarily have a lot of alfalfa, like in the southeastern United States, they have peanut hay. They also have Sericea lespedeza. Both of those are legumes that are high in calcium and protein. So if you've got access to those hays, that's awesome. You can feed those instead. And I think that is about it for the feeding. I see that there are some questions here, so I'm going to answer the questions. Skyrider asks, is it necessary to give goats oxytocin after birth? No, absolutely not. We've had 775 kids. I've never given a goat oxytocin. I'm wondering why. I always want to know the background of a question, like why you're asking that. So if you're, looks like you asked that about 7 minutes ago. So if you're still on and you want to explain a little more, I feel like there's more that I need to tell you, because goats should know. Goats do not need oxytocin after birth. And you, as far as contacting me, you can always comment on our videos, and we can respond to those videos. We also have a membership, Goats 365, and we have meetings almost weekly for that if you need more assistance. Claire said, 2 of our goats exposed to buck in June. One clearly looks pregnant. The other has barely put on weight. But should we be treating her as pregnant if she could put weight on in these last few months? June, July, August, September. So about 3 months. Oh, I wouldn't expect a 3-month pregnant goat to necessarily look pregnant unless she's carrying at least triplets or quads. If your other goat is only 3 months pregnant and really looks like she has gotten a lot bigger, then she could be carrying quads. But the way that a goat looks when they're 3 months pregnant doesn't really mean anything. So if you really want to know, so I think you're probably asking this because I just said what 3 months is when you start giving them alfalfa. I would rather give alfalfa to a dry doe and find out she didn't need it than the other way around. Because if she is pregnant and she's not getting alfalfa, then you could wind up with a really sick goat closer to her due date. Do you give goats free choice baking soda? I don't, but I've been told I should. You must be new to my world because my answer to so many things is it depends. So my does get baking soda, my bucks do not. I have an article about baking soda on the website that explains the baking soda controversy. It's kind of funny because until about 5 or 6 years ago, no one ever said that you shouldn't give baking soda. You shouldn't have free choice baking soda available for your goats. Goats, you should not be sprinkling baking soda on your goats' feed or anything like that. You shouldn't be, because the purpose of baking soda is to keep the rumen balanced, and it's free choice so that the goats can basically self-medicate if they need to. So if your goats like overeat grain or get into something that upsets their rumen, they can get baking soda. The thing about baking soda is that what has caused the controversy is that somebody learned that goats produce bicarbonate. It's in their saliva. And they're like, oh no, if we keep giving goats baking soda, they're going to stop producing their own bicarbonate. And then if we don't give them baking soda, they're all going to die from bloat. I don't know anybody that has ever had that happen. So that's like some kind of a crazy extrapolation that somebody just dreamed up on their own. So when goats chew is when they produce bicarbonate, because they produce saliva when they chew. So when they're eating hay and browse and pasture and all that kind of stuff, they're chewing a lot because they've got this long stem forage. And so they need to chew a lot and they're producing bicarbonate. When goats eat grain or hay pellets like alfalfa pellets, Timothy pellets, or any kind of a goat feed or grain, they don't chew very much. In fact, I'm sure some of you, let me know in the chat, do you have a doe who inhales her grain? Like, she's not chewing at all. She's just inhaling the grain when she's on the milk stand, and eating it as fast as she possibly can. Those are the goats that are going to need baking soda, but you don't need to watch them for that. You just have the baking soda available, and if they need it, they can get it. And I know I found that it was those goats that would inhale the grain on the milk stand. When they went back out into the milking parlor, they would go straight for the baking soda. So my bucks don't get baking soda because they are 100% on pasture and browse and hay. They don't get any goat feed. Whereas my does do have baking soda available, free choice. And I see that Amy shared in the chat. It looks like it only showed up on Facebook. She shared the link to the baking soda article in the chat. So thank you, Amy. Tink's Traveling Farm says, my pygmy dwarf is huge and due in a week, maybe. It's a surprise pregnancy. So maybe you came in late and did not hear me talk about a false pregnancy. I'm wondering anyway, again, like, I would love to hear more details, because maybe she's not pregnant. Maybe she just has a false pregnancy, because unless I don't know what you mean exactly by a surprise pregnancy. But earlier, if you missed earlier when I was talking about a false pregnancy, you might want to go back and watch that after YouTube processes this video, and because the video will be on YouTube forever and you'll be able to watch it later. When does the udder start to fill for second fresheners? It depends. Usually for most goats, you see the udder starting to fill up between, you see some udder development from around 2 to 4 weeks before. I've had second, if it depends, if she's a cross between a Nigerian and a pygmy, pygmies are not great milkers. So it depends on what she's got more of the dairy genetics. Like, if she has more dairy genetics for Nigerian, she could get a huge udder a month before kidding, and you're going, oh my goodness, you poor thing, you look miserable, like you're gonna have to walk around with that udder for a whole month before you kid. On the other hand, if she's got more of the pygmy genetics, it could be like a week before she kids that it really starts to she really starts to get much udder development. So so I think that covers the questions that we've had so far. So let's talk a little bit about management tips now. And that is for as you're going through pregnancy and getting closer to kidding. So if you've been at the last 2 talks, you know that I told you that we have a free course on goat breeding. The goat breeding course has live videos of goats actually breeding. So you can see, what it looks like when a doe has signs of heat, what a standing heat is, what a good breeding versus a failed breeding looks like, so that if your goat actually got bred. And then we also have a free course that's called Preparing for Kidding Season. And that one it's like another 45 minutes of videos that gives you information on getting ready for kidding season and things that you need and why you need them or not, and so on. So a little bit here about getting through pregnancy. One of them is housing. So people who are in my kidding course, because we also have a full-length kidding course that's like over 70 videos, people in there often immediately notice that we have kidding pens which I refer to as our semi-private kidding suites, because they are made with hog panels so that the goats are never really alone. Like they're right there next to another goat, but there's a hog panel between them so that if somebody gets mad, they can't hurt the goat next door. So do you need kidding pens though? And the answer is, if you've only got 3 or 4 goats, probably not. We did not have kidding pens until we had at least 5 or 6 goats. The main reason that you might need kidding, there's a few reasons you might need kidding pens. But a big one is so that nobody picks on the goat that's in labor. You never know how they're going to act. If somebody is being beat up all the time, then odds are good that she's going to continue to get beat up even if she's in labor. So that's always concerning, because you don't want to have goats beating up on a doe when she's in the middle of trying to give birth. That's just incredibly sad and brutal. But some goats are not. Some goats are more mellow, so you just don't know. One thing is, in terms of, it's a good idea to have kidding pens if your goats are not tested for CAE, because if a goat gives birth, so CAE is primarily transmitted through milk and colostrum. So if a doe gives birth to a kid, and that kid might start nursing off of another doe, maybe that doe has CAE, even though her mother didn't have CAE. So I think this is one reason there was a lot of confusion in the early years about, because people would say, oh, well, sometimes a goat has a kid born with CAE and it doesn't have CAE and stuff like that. I think this probably comes from like cross-contamination between goats, because a kid doesn't know that it's supposed to just nurse from its mom. So if you've got the goats in a big pen, you could have a kid born to one goat nursing off of another goat. And in fact, we had that, our sheep lamb on pasture, and we have had sheep that have stolen other used babies or babies. One year, it was one of the earliest years for us actually with our sheep. We went out in the morning and there were 2 ewes out there. They were both black, and they had 4 black lambs. And those 4 black lambs were like just going back and forth between the 2 ewes. We had no idea which 2 lambs belonged to which of the ewes, because they were just nursing like that. So, so if your animals are tested negative for CAE, then and you know everybody is negative, they came from negative herds, then kidding together is not as worrisome as if you don't know what the status of the animals are. We do have a podcast on biosecurity screening with Dr. Claire Burbick from Washington State Diagnostic Labs. That gives you more details on that. And so if you need that, then we can give you a link to that podcast episode so you can learn more about biosecurity testing. But basically the answer to the kidding pens is, if you've only got 3 or 4 goats, you don't necessarily need kidding pens. It's nice. It's good if you can be there when the goat's kid, to make sure that the kid starts nursing off of the correct mom. We actually had a problem with this our very first year. We had 3 goats, and the first goat gave birth when we were there, and she had twins. And then a few days later, we came out, and there were 2 kids, each nursing off of a different doe. And I was very confused, because I knew that like one of those does had triplets last year, and she still actually looked really big. So I called the lady I had bought them from, and she said, oh, I don't think that those kids belong to the 2 different moms. So what she suggested I do is to pick up the kids and leave and see who got upset. And so I did. I picked up the kids and left. And one doe went running through the door screaming, "Bring my babies back!" And so I knew who mom was, and put them in there and took the other goat out. So because she was still pregnant, and so she was letting another kid nurse, which we don't want them to do, because all of the colostrum is produced during pregnancy. And once kids start nursing, that colostrum gets replaced with mature milk, which means that if that kid kept nursing, that her colostrum would just get more and more diluted by the time her own kids were born. Parasite management during pregnancy. We talked about this back 2 weeks ago in the breeding lecture, that it's really important to make sure that your goats do not have a heavy load of parasites before they're bred. If you do wind up in a situation where you need to use a dewormer, Safeguard, ivermectin, and Cydectin, moxidectin, those are safe during pregnancy. Valbazen should not be used in the first trimester, although most people just say, I don't want to use it at all during pregnancy. And levamisole should not be used at the end of pregnancy. But again, most people just don't want to use levamisole at all during pregnancy. And in fact, levamisole is like the strongest dewormer with the lowest margin of safety. So you really shouldn't be using it unless nothing else works anyway. In terms of vaccines, if you do the CDT vaccine, you would give that to the doe about 4 weeks before her due date, so that the kids would have the highest level of those antibodies on board when they're born, before they're old enough to be vaccinated. And then that is pretty much about it for pregnancy. Oh, towards the end of pregnancy, the 2 diseases, I touched on these a little bit, but the 2 diseases that you really need to be aware of are hypocalcemia and toxemia, because those are the ones that goats get at the very end of pregnancy, usually with in the last week or 2. And it's really important that you get, if you are new to this, it's very important that you get your vet to help as soon as possible, because there is a ton of misinformation online about this. And this is a great example of like placebo effect. A lot of people think like, oh, a couple of Tums will cure hypocalcemia. It does not. If a goat has hypocalcemia, it needs about 5,000 milligrams of calcium, and 2 Tums would only have 1,000 milligrams. So a lot of people overdiagnose toxemia and hypocalcemia. And then when they use something that is completely worthless, like a couple of Tums, they think like, oh, it worked because the goat's fine. But the reality is the goat was always fine. So you could have given the goat peanut butter and it would still be fine. So it's really, really important to make sure that you get proper diagnoses for these things and proper treatment as soon as possible. And if a goat really seriously has hypocalcemia, I mean, we're talking all the muscles are no longer functioning. The goat cannot stand. You probably that goat needs like IV calcium, because that works the quickest. If you give IV calcium to a goat with hypocalcemia, they're like on their feet within minutes. If they're that far gone, the digestive system may no longer be working. So an oral calcium would not work. There's like multiple levels of hypocalcemia, and I go into that in a lot more detail in my full-length kidding course, so that you know what that is. And also the other thing that I want to talk about before I get to the questions again is toxemia, because so many people think their goat is in labor long before it's in labor. And I've had people think their goat was in labor like 2 weeks before the due date, and they're freaking out that their goat is going to give birth prematurely. And it's like, send me a video. No, does not. No, your goat's not in labor. And if it is, there's nothing you can do about it. Like if the kids are born 2 weeks early, the kids are born 2 weeks early, and you'll just have to do whatever you need to do at that point. You might need to bottle feed them. They might not make it if the lungs aren't mature enough, but so many people have done that. And then like the goat gives birth 2 weeks later and the kids are all perfectly fine and healthy. So one time somebody contacted me and said, my goat has been in labor for 2 days, wondering what I should do. And thank goodness she sent me a video, because the second I saw that video, I just responded and said, your goat is not in labor. Your goat has toxemia. You need to call a vet immediately or she's going to die. She did call the vet immediately. The vet did a C-section, and unfortunately the doe did die, but at least the kids, they were able to save the kids. So toxemia, it's pretty surprising the goat lived. And the reason she thought her goat was in labor for 2 days is because the goat had stopped eating. It is amazing to me that the goat lived for 2 days after it stopped eating. Usually they're not going to last more than about a day after they stop eating. So, and that is a case, where you need to have veterinary assistance. So back to some questions here. Thank you, Tinks Traveling Farm. I'm so happy to hear that you find the information helpful. I see Amy has shared in the chat links to our courses about goat breeding, and then also the one about preparing for kidding season. And then Claire said, are the drenches you've mentioned suitable for goats whose milk will be used for human consumption? I'm trying to think which one, because that was about 5 minutes ago when you asked. If maybe that was when I was talking about dewormers. I'm trying to think that. I think that was the only drench I mentioned. There is a different withdrawal period for every dewormer. And we have in our article on, in our article on dewormers, we've got a link to the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. So yes, so this is not a yes or no question. If a goat is treated with a dewormer, it depends. So every dewormer has a different milk withdrawal, and they are all different based upon the mode of administration. So you should never inject a dewormer in a goat because it has what they call a very long tail. It stays in the goat's body at a very low level for months. And that means it also gets into the milk. So like if you injected ivermectin, there would be ivermectin in the milk at some level for 40 something days. And injectable Cydectin, which the generic form of that is moxidectin, that is even more. That is like that is closer to 3 months for the Cydectin. So obviously nobody wants to milk their goat and dump the milk for 2 or 3 months. So just don't use injectable dewormers with goats. The topicals have the quickest withdrawal, but they're not recommended for worms. That would be for lice. So for treating worms, goats should always be given oral dewormers, and the withdrawal period on that is going to vary depending on which one it is. It could be anywhere from a week to 3 weeks, depending on the drug. And that is on the 2024 version of the dewormer chart that we make available to people, that is from the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. So we can give you a link to our, I can't think. We can give you a link to our article on the website about worms. And I think it is on there. So actually, I know I have this one memorized. It's thriftyhomesteader.com/goat-worms. And so there's information there about treating worms in goats, and then also the up-to-date information on milk withdrawal. And you have to, for that, you have to read, because it's the chart is on page 1, and then page 2 and 3 give you all the information about withdrawal, and also different types of worms. Like the front is all about using it for intestinal worms. The dosages are not the same for like meningeal worm and lungworm and all those things. Tapeworms, those are different dosages. And so that information also is in the text that's on page 2 and 3. So it looks like I think I have answered all the questions. If anybody has another question, go ahead and post in the comments. And I'm just going to take one last look at my notes. I don't see anything. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And if you've got questions, feel free to post in the comment section below. In the comment section, Amy has given you guys the links to our free courses on goat breeding and also on preparing for kidding season. And once you're in our courses, every video has a discussion area where you can ask more questions, and you can even upload photos there. So if you've got questions about a specific goat or whatever, a lot of times we ask for photos. So it's a lot easier to chat there than it is on YouTube, because you can't post photos in the comments on YouTube. So you are all very welcome. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and we will see you again soon. Bye for now.